far in world history, we've seen the ways in which epidemic diseases gave Europeans an advantage in their quest to conquer other parts of the world, particularly in the Americas. In this video, we're going to be discussing some of the diseases that put Europeans at a disadvantage in their pursuit of conquest and power, at least for a little while. We're going to be talking about tropical diseases. Tropical diseases are diseases that are prevalent in tropical and subtropical areas, areas that include a warmer temperature year-round and higher volumes of rain annually than non-tropical regions. This combination breeds insects, in particular the mosquito, that can act as direct carriers of tropical diseases like yellow fever and malaria. So let's start by talking about yellow fever, because yellow fever would have a determinant quality in the history of the Americas. Scientists and historians believe that yellow fever has plagued the world for at least 3,000 years. It's caused by a virus that's spread by mosquito bites and likely started in the rainforests of Central Africa. It spread rapidly through the tropical climate of the continent. The disease begins with flu-like symptoms and can be spread relatively rapidly and can move into a second, more toxic phase pretty easily. This second toxic phase is characterized by a high fever, by jaundice resulting from liver disease, by bleeding in the gastrointestinal tract that can result in black vomit and black stools, and death results in about 50% of toxic cases. So while yellow fever is not universally fatal, it is an incredibly dangerous disease. As we said, it was a disease that originated in tropical Africa, but would be brought to the tropical Caribbean by Europeans. It was a side effect of the transatlantic slave trade. When Europeans brought mosquitoes, they also brought with them yellow fever and malaria. And mosquitoes flourished in the Caribbean islands because of the sugar plantations. In building sugar plantations, these plantation owners would basically raise everything in their path. They eliminated insect predators like birds and bats and created ideal habitats for mosquitoes by increasing sources of standing water, which were the byproducts of cane field agriculture. The sugar plantations also supported larger populations, so there was a steady supply of hosts and carriers for yellow fever. It was more or less the perfect storm for yellow fever. And because of the nature of yellow fever, it created a unique environment in which newcomers who had no natural or acquired immunities to either disease found it particularly deadly. In other words, it was particularly deadly for Europeans. There was no effective way to control the growth of mosquito population or to treat the diseases, and so many newcomers fell prey to this disease in devastating numbers. Now let's talk a little bit about immunity to the disease, because yellow fever is one of those diseases that, if it strikes in childhood, is relatively common, and it's relatively mild. But more importantly, one exposure to the disease, or one experience of the disease, confers immunity for life. So what's happening is that the native populations of these islands, the people who live on these islands, contract the disease as children. And then they therefore, or thereby, get this immunity for life. And that ended up giving these island populations an advantage over the Europeans. Newcomers to the Caribbean always suffered the worst effects of yellow fever. So Spain would come in and bring with them these mosquitoes, bring with them the yellow fever and the malaria as they created these sugar colonies or these sugar plantations in the Caribbean. And they suffered the effects of disease. But the longer that Spain stayed, and remember, Spain had about a century head start on the rest of Europe. Spain and Portugal had about a century's head start on the rest of Europe in terms of colonizing this new world. So the longer that Spain was there, the more immunity their populations built up. When other European countries like France or the Netherlands or England came in and wanted to challenge Spanish supremacy in the Caribbean, they were often foiled by yellow fever. So yellow fever became a protection mechanism for the Spanish colonies in the New World. But it would also prove to be the undoing of the Spanish colonies in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Haitian Revolution, for example, at the end of the 18th and into the beginning of the 19th century, was a slave revolt that was aided by yellow fever. France's loss, the Haitian victory, was largely the result of a massive yellow fever outbreak that destroyed both French and British armies that were sent to recover the island. When Spanish America erupted in revolutions in the early 19th century, many local disease-resistant troops sided with the rebels. That left Spain with no choice but to recruit other European troops who succumbed to disease very, very easily. So yellow fever, then, in many ways defined the European colonial adventure in the Americas. Fast forward to the 19th century, and we can see another example of how tropical diseases shaped European colonialism, this time in Africa. Europe saw an end to its American colonies in the late 18th and early 19th century, thanks in large part to tropical diseases like yellow fever. But they weren't finished with colonialism just yet. In the 19th century, in the mid to late 19th century, European powers engaged in what would become known as the Scramble for Africa. The Scramble for Africa was this rush to divide up territories in Africa among the European powers of the 19th century. Now, European interest in Africa was nothing new. They'd been connected with North Africa across the Mediterranean for millennia. They'd been connected with West Africa for centuries. They'd managed to circumnavigate the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, opening up southern Africa and the eastern coast of Africa. So Europe had been in contact with coastal Africa for centuries by the time we get to the 1800s. But the tropical interior of Africa had been largely closed for a couple of reasons. Number one was disease. Disease had allowed Europe to conquer the Americas relatively easily. The spread of things like influenza and smallpox had devastated Native American populations that had no immunity to the disease. But the indigenous populations of Africa had immunity to these diseases. They'd had smallpox for millennia as well, and they were just as immune as European populations were. Plus, Africa had diseases of its own, things like yellow fever, malaria, sleeping sickness, or a disease called Nagana, which was a disease of horses. And Europeans, it's a situation where the shoe is on the other foot, and Europeans have no immunity to these tropical diseases. So, disease helped protect the tropical interior of Africa. Weapons had also allowed Europe to conquer the Americas relatively easily. They had guns, but those guns weren't particularly accurate, and they were particularly hard to use without horses. And the horses, remember, were dying as Europe moved into Central Africa because of the Nagana, because of that disease. So most of the fighting was done the old-fashioned way in Africa, with swords. And the indigenous populations of Africa had swords, which put them on an equal footing with the Europeans, at least until the 19th century and industrialization. Two major technological changes allowed Europe to expand. One was the steamship. A lot of African rivers, particularly in the central region, are not navigable by sail. With the arrival of the steamship, Europeans were able to go upriver into areas where they'd never been able to go before, particularly into the tropical center of Africa and into the Congo region. The second major advance that allowed Europe to expand into Africa was the discovery of quinine. Quinine, which was used to treat malaria, allowed Europeans to travel into the region without dying from the disease. And while quinine isn't quite as effective as anti-malarial medication in the modern world, it was relatively effective at controlling and moderating the effects of the disease. So because of these two innovations, Western and Central Africa were opened up to European expansion. And then as Europeans settled into Africa, into all parts of Africa, they brought with them European ways of life and European economic structures, many of which made malaria worse. Over generations, native Africans had developed antibodies to malaria, and more importantly, they developed life patterns that helped to prevent the spread of malaria, helped them avoid infection in the first place. For example, these African tribes in the central region tended to settle in high or dry locations, away from the wet, humid areas where mosquitoes breed. They lived in relatively small communities, spread out over vast areas, which limited the control or limited the level of transmission. Europeans, when they came into Africa in the 19th century, didn't understand this. They modeled the patterns of European cities, building close to water in densely populated urban areas that were great for efficiency of production and factories and transmission of goods, but recreated breeding grounds for mosquitoes, created an epidemic or recreated an epidemic crisis with which Africa is still dealing today. Thank you.